The War of Three Kingdoms. How the English Civil War began. How does a king lose his head, literally, and take a nation to the brink of chaos? Was it divine destiny or just a tragic comedy of errors? It all started with a man who believed he had a hotline to heaven. Charles I, heir to the divine right of kings. But what happens when a man convinced he's God's chosen ruler meets a parliament determined to clip his celestial wings? Spoiler alert, it's not a polite tea party. Why did Charles pawn the royal jewels like a gambler out of options? What drove a nation to revolt over tonnage and poundage? And no, that's not the latest diet trend. And who was William Laud, the Archbishop so controversial that he made sermons as explosive as gunpowder? From Scotland's infamous stool riot that turned a congregation into a battlefield to the eerie scheming of the Long Parliament, we'll uncover the scandal, the betrayal, and the jaw-dropping twists that ignited a civil war. Brace yourself for a tale of stolen crowns, fiery sermons, and a brewing storm that would shatter England, Scotland, and Ireland alike. This isn't just history, it's a soap opera with swords. Curious? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell now, because trust us, you don't want to miss how a stool, a sermon, and a stubborn king set the stage for the War of the Three Kingdoms. It all began on March 24, 1603, when Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, took her last breath. With no heirs to her name, the crown of England passed to her nearest relative, James VI of Scotland. James, the son of the ill-fated Mary, Queen of Scots, was a man forged in the fires of political intrigue and chaos. Raised amidst Scottish clan feuds and overzealous Presbyterian tutors, James developed a unique blend of scholarly charm, awkward social habits, and a firm belief in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs ruled by God's will and were answerable to no earthly power. James's arrival in England marked the first time that England, Scotland, and Ireland were united under one monarch. Theoretically, this was a splendid moment of unity, but in practice, it was like inviting three unruly siblings to dinner with only one dessert. The English disliked James's Scottish roots. The Scots thought him too English, and the Irish, well, they'd already seen centuries of English mismanagement. James, however, was undeterred. After all, God had chosen him to rule. What could possibly go wrong? James's reign wasn't all theological debates and royal pageantry. It was marked by a particularly explosive event, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. A group of disgruntled Catholic conspirators, led by Robert Catesby and his fiery sidekick, Guy Fawkes, hatched a daring plan to blow up the House of Lords during its opening session. Their aim? To assassinate James and replace him with a Catholic monarch. The plan might have succeeded if not for one fatal flaw: human kindness. One of the conspirators sent an anonymous letter warning a friend in Parliament to stay away. The letter made its way to the authorities, and a midnight search of the cellars beneath Westminster revealed Guy Fawkes sitting nonchalantly on a barrel of gunpowder. After some gentle persuasion, read brutal torture, Fawkes spilled the beans. The plot was foiled, the conspirators were executed, and November 5th became a day for fireworks, bonfires, and effigies of Guy Fawkes. James died in March 1625, leaving the throne to his second son, Charles I. Unlike his father, Charles was reserved, devout, and steadfast, some might say stubborn to the point of self-destruction. He shared James's belief in the divine right of kings, but lacked his father's political savvy. Charles's marriage to Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, set alarm bells ringing in Protestant England. The Queen's open promotion of Catholicism and her frosty relations with Parliament did little to endear her to the populace. At the heart of the conflict was Parliament, an institution evolving into a force of political power. Unlike today's Houses of Lords and Commons, which operate within a constitutional framework, 17th century Parliament existed at the king's pleasure. It could only convene by royal decree, yet it wielded immense influence in one critical area: taxation. The king might wield divine authority, but without Parliament's approval, he couldn't fund his ambitions. It is said that desperate times call for desperate measures, and for Charles I, the early 17th century was a masterclass in desperation. With a parliament tighter than a miser's purse strings, the king found himself juggling the crown jewels, literally, as he sought to scrape together the funds to rule a kingdom increasingly skeptical of his authority. In a move that might make modern monarchs cringe, Charles borrowed money using the crown jewels as collateral. Imagine the scene: a royal emissary presenting a sparkling tiara and a scepter to an incredulous banker. "This is worth a kingdom," they'd insist. And though they were technically correct, the jewels did little to soften the growing anger among Charles's subjects. Charles didn't stop there. He levied customs duties, known as tonnage and poundage, without parliamentary approval. Think of it as a king's version of swiping a credit card he didn't own. Then came the pièce de résistance, forced loans. Wealthy subjects were asked to contribute, though refusal often meant a one-way trip to a dank prison cell. Generosity, in Charles's lexicon, was not optional. Arbitrary imprisonment was a tool Charles wielded with unsettling ease. When gentlemen refused to pay, they found themselves jailed without trial, a practice traditionally reserved for national emergencies. Except, of course, there wasn't an invasion or plague, just a king in dire need of cash. To the public, this was not just an overreach, it was a royal slap in the face. Enter Sir Edward Coke, a parliamentary knight in shining armor, or at least an impeccably starched ruff. Coke authored the Petition of Right, a bold document outlining liberties Charles couldn't infringe, such as freedom from arbitrary imprisonment and taxation without consent. Cornered and broke, Charles reluctantly accepted the petition, though he reportedly believed he was merely reaffirming ancient liberties. "What's the harm?" he likely mused. Spoiler: plenty. Parliament was still smoldering with indignation when in 1629 Charles overstepped again by collecting customs without their consent. Tempers flared, and when the king ordered Parliament to adjourn, chaos erupted. Members held the Speaker, John Finch, in his chair, physically preventing him from ending the session. Resolutions condemning the king's actions were read aloud amidst the melee. Charles, livid, dissolved Parliament on March 10, 1629, arresting ringleaders like John Eliot and Denzil Hollis. These arrests, however, turned the accused into martyrs, galvanizing opposition to royal absolutism. Charles was a man of refined tastes, a lover of art, a patron of beauty, and a king who, quite unfortunately, had a knack for alienating his people faster than a Puritan sermon could empty a tavern. All seemed well as he wed the elegant and devoutly Catholic Maria Henrietta of France. The royal couple settled into marital bliss, or at least Maria did. But as history would soon reveal, Maria's fervent Catholicism was less of a charming quirk and more of a ticking time bomb. Maria Henrietta arrived in England with an entourage of Catholic attendants whose zeal rivaled that of crusaders. Charles, however, seemed to find their company delightful. He often relaxed among them, sipping wine and chatting about art, philosophy, and, if we are to believe the Puritan gossip, how to smuggle Rome's influence back into England. Of course, Charles wasn't going Catholic. He simply found Puritans and their perpetual scowling insufferable. Unfortunately for him, the Protestant majority didn't buy it. The Queen's court was viewed as a Vatican satellite, and paranoia about England's return to the papal fold spread faster than gossip at a royal ball. In 1633, Charles appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. If the king thought Laud would be a calming influence, he was sorely mistaken. Laud, a man whose demeanor could curdle milk, set about enforcing his vision of the Church of England. His innovations earned him the nickname Pope Light and convinced Puritans they were being frog-marched back to Catholicism. His methods? Ruthless. Opponents of episcopacy were dragged to court, including three infamous Puritans, John Bastwick, William Prynne, and Henry Burton. Bastwick, a fiery pamphleteer, had the audacity to challenge Laud's reforms. Prynne, a lawyer with a penchant for verbose critiques, had already lost his ears in 1634 for lambasting the theater as the devil's playground. Burton, a preacher, accused Laud of being a papal stooge. Their punishment in 1637 was barbaric. They were pilloried, branded as seditious libelers, and their remaining ears were lopped off. Laud hoped to crush dissent, but instead, he made martyrs of the trio. Moderate Protestants recoiled in horror, and whispers of rebellion grew louder. Meanwhile, Charles needed money but detested the meddling of Parliament. His solution? Financial gymnastics that made medieval tax collectors look restrained. Monopolies were sold, granting exclusive rights over industries. The most infamous was the soap monopoly, derisively nicknamed Popish soap. Rumored to blister hands and Protestant souls alike, this soap became a symbol of royal greed. Then came the revival of ancient finds. Living in royal forests? Fined. Building outside London's city limits? Fined. But here's the kicker. Charles didn't actually want people to stop breaking these rules. He just wanted to keep fining them. The pièce de résistance of his fiscal creativity was the reintroduction of ship money. Originally a levy for coastal defense, Charles extended it inland, arguing that his lawyers, always conveniently loyal, deemed it necessary. The inland gentry, seeing no ships and no emergency, were outraged. John Hampden, a gentleman farmer, refused to pay and became a hero of individual liberty. While England grumbled, Scotland erupted. In 1637, Charles and Laud attempted to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer on the fiercely Presbyterian Scots. The result? Chaos. At St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, a servant girl famously hurled a stool at the minister attempting to read the new liturgy, shouting, "Dinna dare meddle wi' our faith." Her stool became a symbol of defiance. By February 1638, the Scots formalized their resistance with the National Covenant, pledging loyalty to the king but vowing to preserve their Presbyterian church. This movement, known as the Covenanters, gained widespread support. Attempts at negotiation failed, and war became inevitable. The Scottish army, motivated and disciplined, began preparing for battle. Charles, on the other hand, scrambled for funds and soldiers, relying heavily on Catholic aristocrats, much to the chagrin of his Protestant subjects. The pressure on Charles mounted. His personal rule, which had started with a veneer of tranquility, was cracking under the weight of dissent. Laud's authoritarianism, unpopular financial policies, and the Scottish rebellion pushed the kingdom toward the brink. The Venetian ambassador, ever the dramatic observer, described Laud as the pest that will disturb the kingdom. The First Bishops' War of 1639 ended in what can only be described as an awkward handshake agreement, the pacification of Berwick. Everyone involved knew this treaty was a dud, a band-aid on a broken leg. Both sides scurried off to prepare for round two, but Charles hit a major snag. His treasury was as dry as a Puritan sermon. With no money to fund his dreams of conquest, Charles did the unthinkable. He summoned Parliament on April 13, 1640, after an 11-year hiatus. This session became known as the Short Parliament, not because of its length but because it folded faster than a gambler with a bad hand. After just 3 weeks of squabbling, Charles dissolved it in frustration on May 5th. Desperate for funds, the king resumed collecting the wildly unpopular ship money tax. Unfortunately, taxing your subjects into oblivion tends to dampen their enthusiasm for your reign. Armed with a mix of swagger and desperation, Charles launched into the Second Bishops' War. It was an unmitigated disaster. The Scottish Covenanters, led by the brilliant and battle-hardened Earl of Leven, outmaneuvered the English forces and secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Newburn. This marked the first Scottish victory on English soil since 1388, and the Scots were so confident they occupied northeastern England like they owned the place, which, temporarily, they did. Leven, having honed his skills under Gustavus Adolphus in the 30 Years' War, brought military precision that the English couldn't match. Charles, humiliated and out of options, signed the Treaty of Ripon, agreeing to pay the Scots £850 per day to maintain their occupation. It was like paying rent to your invaders, a move that didn't win Charles any fans. Bankrupt and out of excuses, Charles was forced to convene what would become the Long Parliament on November 3, 1640. Unlike its predecessor, this parliament wasn't going anywhere. United against the king, radical Puritan elements began chipping away at his power. They impeached and executed the Earl of Strafford, the king's closest advisor, and launched proceedings against Archbishop Laud. Then came the Grand Remonstrance, a document so packed with grievances, it might as well have been titled, "Everything You've Ever Done Wrong, Charles." In 1641, while Charles was still licking his wounds, Ireland erupted in a Catholic rebellion led by Phelim O'Neill. Thousands of Protestants were killed, and the crisis demanded immediate action. But who would lead the army? Parliament didn't trust Charles, and Charles certainly didn't trust Parliament. It was a deadlock of epic proportions. In January 1642, Charles decided subtlety was overrated. Marching into the House of Commons with 400 soldiers, he attempted to arrest 5 MPs, including John Pym and John Hampden. The MPs had already fled, leaving Charles to stand awkwardly in an empty chamber, a royal version of showing up to a party uninvited and finding the house deserted. With London no longer safe, Charles retreated to Windsor Castle and later to York. Both sides began raising armies, skirting constitutional rules with bold initiatives. Parliament issued the Militia Ordinance, naming Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, as their commander. Charles countered with the Commission of Array, relying on loyal nobles to rally troops. When Charles attempted to seize the armory at Hull, the city's governor, Sir John Hotham, slammed the gates in his face. Defeated and humiliated, Charles retreated to Nottingham, where he raised his royal standard on August 22, 1642, officially kicking off the English Civil War. A storm promptly blew the banner down, a sign perhaps of the tempest ahead. As the royalists scrambled to bolster their numbers, Prince Rupert, Charles's nephew and a cavalry genius, scored an early victory at Powick Bridge on September 23, 1642. Rupert's superior tactics routed the parliamentary horsemen, marking the first engagement of the war. Parliamentarian Hugh Peters later called it "where England's sorrows began." Little did anyone know, this skirmish was the opening act of a conflict that would tear the nation apart. With each side convinced of their righteousness, England stood on the brink of a war that would forever alter its history. In our next episode, we'll unravel the shocking twists and deadly turns that transformed the king into a martyr and England into a battleground. From the blood-soaked fields after Powick Bridge to the trial that changed history forever, get ready for a ride packed with rebellion, revenge, and just the right dash of dark humor. But how did it all lead to the ultimate act of rebellion? A king, tried and executed by his own people? Did Charles seal his fate with his stubbornness, or was it the storm of ambition and betrayal swirling around him? And as the Civil War raged on, tearing the nation apart, heroes and villains emerged, some fighting for justice, others for power, and a few just because they liked a good fight. Don't miss out. Subscribe now and click that notification bell, because trust us, you'll want to be front row for the chaos, the comedy, and the carnage. Welcome to the War of the Three Kingdoms, where history isn't just told, it's lived.